Okay, I'm excited to introduce Sena Crutchley. Sena is an associate professor in communication sciences and disorders and is co-founder and president of Piedmont Area Vegan Educators. Sena serves on her university's Sustainability Council, where she shares her expertise in the ethics of food systems. Sena is a frequent speaker for the Peace Advocacy Network and her local Sierra Club, and founded and runs Ruby's Refuge, a microsanctuary for chickens. Sena, we'll go ahead and get it.
Thank you so much, Justin, and thank you, Hope. I'm so excited about this opportunity to speak at one of my favorite conferences. I think the first conference was where I learned about John Sanbanmatsu and some of your other speakers, so I just really appreciate this opportunity. And thank you all for taking some time out of your Saturday to join us. So let me share my slides. And we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so my topic today is about marketing tactics that are designed to deceive consumers into believing that the products that we buy are not harmful. But before we dive in, I want to share a little bit more about me and how I became interested in this topic. Besides reading Hope's book, The Ultimate Betrayal, and reading Robert Grillo's book, Farm to Fable, I grew up eating animals and blindly supporting other forms of exploitation. I went vegetarian in high school, and then I went vegan in 2012 after visiting a local dairy farm. And in their ice cream shop, in their refrigerator case, there were big chunks of bloody cow flesh. And that was kind of my wake-up call. Also, my field as speech-language pathology gives me a soft spot for people who are unheard, and that includes human and non-human animals. So also as a speech-language pathologist, I'm fascinated by how and why we use language. And unfortunately, language and images can be used to manipulate and deceive. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So you'll hear me refer to the chickens at my microsanctuary, Ruby's Refuge, that Justin mentioned. And I should shout out to the Microsanctuary Resource Center because they did help us get started. I'd like to introduce you to Ruby. I learned about this humane hoax notion many years ago, but it took on a whole new meaning for me after adopting Ruby and her 3 sisters in January of 2019. The idea that it's okay to kill and eat them because they're cage-free and they eat an organic diet and they live a good life, that's a hoax. And the idea that there is a humane way to kill someone who doesn't want to die is a hoax. All right, so let's get into some details about this humane hoax. Many of you might be thinking that I'm going to talk about that ever popular topic of factory farming. But if we only focus on the most obvious industrialized practices, then it creates this false sense that we are not complicit in harm when we consume animals who we believe were raised and killed through better systems. So what I hope that we come away with today is an understanding that an entirely plant-sourced food system will always be more sustainable and more just than even the most cage-free, local, regenerative, organic, grass-fed, green, small, family-owned, humane, sustainable, free-range, chocolate on the pillow, tucked in bed at night food system. So today I'm going to address some of the biggest myths that allow this exploitation industry to persist. And we're going to begin with greenwashing and the environmental impact of animal exploitation. So the first myth is that there is a way to make the farming of animals sustainable. A lot of money, time, and effort go into trying to make the animal exploitation industries at least appear sustainable. Another myth is that regenerative agriculture that uses cows, also known as rotational grazing, is the solution to our concerns about climate footprint and soil health. And then another myth is that it's okay to eat some kinds of animals and their eggs and milk as long as one avoids eating cows. And then the fourth myth that we'll talk about today is one of implied consent. There are many more myths, but these are really the ones that I'm going to talk about today. So before we talk about the myths and deceptions, I want to share with you some important facts about animal exploitation and how that impacts the environment. So we'll start off with the environment. Because, a healthy environment is important for all of us, human and non-human animals. And these facts are so glaring and stark that the animal exploitation industry has come up with ways to minimize how they might impact consumer perceptions. And so we're going to talk about these strategies later. This statement from the Alliance of World Scientists will be of no surprise after we talk about the environmental facts related to animal exploitation. The number one thing individuals can do for the environment is avoid all animal products. So if that information is readily available, and it is, and even though it's often hidden from us unless we go looking for it, why are people still consuming animals and their secretions? All right, so we're going to talk about the myth of sustainability, and we're going to start with one of the most palpable environmental problems with animal-based food systems. So starting with greenhouse gas emissions, the reports range for animal agriculture from like around 14% to 51%. And more recently, I've seen higher figures. It varies because it depends on how the emissions are measured. But when we look at the totality of animal agriculture, which would include not just the methane produced by cows and other ruminants, but also the running of slaughterhouses, transporting animals to slaughterhouses and then their body parts from slaughterhouses, transporting feed and other supplies, refrigeration, etc. The higher numbers are really more accurate. And you also see that vegans are responsible for far less greenhouse gas emissions than non-vegans. So let's take a look at why. So this infographic is a study that was completed in Germany, and it takes a look at greenhouse gas emissions according to diet type. So it looks at an omnivorous diet on the bottom compared to a vegetarian diet and compared to a vegan diet. The dark green band represents a conventional diet, and then the light green band is an all organic diet. So say you have someone who is on an omnivorous diet and with good intentions, they change to all organic. You can see they really just make a dent in their climate footprint. And then maybe you have someone who decides to go vegetarian. So you see that's better, but there really is no good comparison to a fully vegan diet. So simply by cutting out eggs and animal milk products, there's a significant drop in greenhouse gas emissions and the climate footprint. So even someone who is eating all conventional as a vegan, they have a much better climate footprint than someone who eats all organic as a vegetarian and someone who eats all organic as an omnivore. And then I also thought this was interesting from that same study, because we really rarely hear about just cutting out cheese. But we often hear people saying, I just can't give up cheese, even though we know there are some great vegan cheeses out there. But you can see that the greenhouse gas emissions from cheese is actually higher, from dairy cheese, is actually higher than that of cow flesh. And just by eliminating cow flesh, and sometimes you'll hear that recommendations, like someone might say, and I hate to use these euphemisms, so forgive me, but someone might say, I've given up beef. And we know that's cow flesh. But that really just makes a teeny dent in their climate footprint. So let's see if we can move on and talk about some other areas of animal agriculture that we don't hear about as much as greenhouse gas emissions. So land use is far more extensive with animal sourced food systems, as you can see. And that's because so much land is used to grow feed for the animals, and the animals simply take up more space, more land. The leading cause of biodiversity loss is the loss of wild areas due to agriculture using animals. And with fossil fuels, this figure surprised me, that it takes about 10 times more fossil fuels to produce 1 calorie of animal protein as compared to 1 calorie of plant protein. And that's probably partly because of those extra steps that I mentioned earlier in the animal food systems. So with transportation and refrigeration and all that. And this just doesn't occur in plant-based food systems. Okay, so looking further to water use, and this is again something that we don't hear about often. The need for clean, fresh water is huge, as you know. So as someone who has lived in drought-prone areas, I appreciate having access to water. We've had droughts here. I've lived in San Diego. I've been through drought. About a half of the fresh water used in the United States is used by animal agriculture. And I'm going to repeat that again, even though we're not all from the United States, but I think this just puts it into perspective. About half of the fresh water used in the United States is used by animal agriculture. About a third of our fresh water used globally is used by animal agriculture. So imagine if we could free up all of that fresh water, how amazing that would be. And then another issue is known as pre-consumer food loss. I may have learned that from Hope, but pre-consumer food loss is about how much food is wasted in the pre-production process, and it's far more than with plant agriculture, because you can see that far more food product, animal feed, is used into going into raising the animals for food than what is actually yielded. It really doesn't happen in plant agriculture. So if our entire planet was on a plant-based food system, and I know that's not happening today, but if it was, then we could feed 4 billion more people. So this is also clearly a social justice issue, not just for non-human animals, but for humans. Okay, so how about the myth that it's okay to consume some animals or secretions like eggs and milk? So I want to start with aquatic animals. Again, an issue that's often overlooked or forgotten, or people just aren't aware. And so you can see that there is a huge amount of food loss with aquatic animals. And it's this wasteful, ridiculous cycle of feeding food to fishes who are then turned into fish meal. And then the fish meal is fed to chickens, turkeys, and pigs. And it's all unnecessary. And I think that's a big issue to come back to today, is that it's all unnecessary, as we know if we are already living vegan. Okay, so what about the eco certifications? You will hear about organizations that refer to the fishes as being sustainable. The problem is that these certifications often come from organizations that do the exploiting, so like aquariums. And with farmed fishes, we see the same problems that we do with farmed land animals: increases in antibiotic use and disease. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the environmental impact of the chicken exploitation industry. A huge amount of water is consumed simply by the chicken staying hydrated. Also, the cleaning process at farms and slaughterhouses, especially slaughterhouses, takes a lot of clean water to manage all the blood and feces in a way that minimizes the spread of disease. That then becomes wastewater, and that wastewater leads to algae blooms, which leads to ocean dead zones, and then fish kills. We saw fish kills in which thousands of individual fishes died on the coast of North Carolina after Hurricane Florence in 2018. And I know within this past year, they've been occurring in Florida on the coast. And this wastewater also contains some very dangerous pathogens. There's also opportunity food loss in eggs, and just like we saw with chicken flesh. And so more feed goes in than actually is yielded. So you can see there's about a 40% protein loss with eggs, and it's worse for dairy, 75% protein loss for dairy. Okay, so now we'll look at the deception, the hoax. We're going to discuss the greenwashing and humane washing techniques that support this hoax. And many of you are probably familiar with greenwashing. And it relates to marketing strategies that companies will use to deceive customers into thinking that their products or services are environmentally friendly when they're really not. So humane washing is basically the same concept. Companies will use terms in their marketing to trick an unsuspecting consumer into thinking that their product is kind to animals, when we know that's simply not true. So we're going to talk about marketing terms, but I also thought it was important to look at these images because these also impact consumer perceptions, and they're still related to supporting that hoax. These pictures of the smiling pigs for barbecue ads reminds me of Robert Grillo's book. And being in North Carolina near the infamous Lexington barbecue, those pictures are everywhere. And these images make one think that animals are happy about being killed and eaten. And then this milk container shows this bucolic image with this beautiful cow happily consuming grass. And then the grass-fed beef logo below it emphasizes grass as if grass is some magical tool that makes exploiting and slaughtering harmless. And the words included in the images are strategically used to make the consumer feel okay about choosing to buy the product. Happy, local, sustainable, 100% certified, grass-fed, organic grass milk. What in the world? So it's interesting to me, I want to share this with you, that years ago, after I had already been vegan, I saw a post from Organic Valley, and that's the maker of that grass milk in the corner. I saw a post from them, and I asked them in response to that post, what happens with the cows when they're no longer viable milk producers? And I was surprised that they replied honestly, and they said that they had to slaughter the cows, and it's usually about 2 years old. I just added that, but they said that they had to slaughter the cows because it wasn't economically feasible to continue caring for these cows until their natural deaths, with many of us know that they could live up to 20 years. And I wish I saved a screenshot of that conversation, but I don't know if they would be that honest now. So, okay, talking about greenwashing first, and you will see some overlap in these terms, but you're probably familiar with most or all of these terms, so maybe just scan through them because I'm not going to address each of them here. But I did want to talk about local on the bottom of the list because I often hear eat local, very popular with locavores. But terms like that, like we don't really stop to think about or ask what they mean, or if there's any validity to it. So the transportation phase of food systems really only accounts for about 11% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the production phase that's so heavy, resulting in about 83% of emissions. And the production phase is far more extensive in animal-based food systems like we saw earlier. So it's not about how far the food has traveled, it's the type of food. Poor and Nemechek in 2018, in their study of over 38,000 farms and 119 countries included in that study, and this is a quote, "Even the highest impact vegetable, like tofu, for example, still emits less than the lowest impact animal protein. A kilo of soy shipped halfway around the world inflicts much less atmospheric harm than a kilo of chicken or pork or beef reared on the local farm." So despite all of these greenwashing terms, Poor and Nemechek state the lowest impact meat and dairy are more environmentally damaging than the least sustainable plant agriculture with grains and vegetables. And then Poor, who became vegan as a result of running this study, reported that a vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. Not just with greenhouse gas emissions, but with global acidification and eutrophication, land use, and water use. It's far bigger than cutting down on your flights or buying an electric car. And that's pretty compelling to me. All right, so what about grass-fed cows? This is another one that we hear celebrated often, don't we? And it's far from sustainable. The greenhouse gas emissions are higher than that of conventionally raised cows. And that's surprising. It's still surprising. And I promise I'm not advocating conventional agriculture with cows. You know, I'm advocating living vegan. But those higher emissions from grass-fed cows are because of their digestive systems, and that it takes longer for them to grow to slaughter weight. And then there really are so many problems with this darling of the exploitation industry. There's increased land use, biodiversity loss from wildlife being displaced or killed, and native plant species being destroyed. And the cows are still killed in the same slaughterhouses as other cows. All right, so more about cows. We've probably all heard by now about this other darling of the cow exploitation industries. Agriculture can be regenerative without the exploitation of animals. But when we hear the term regenerative agriculture, they typically mean rotational grazing. And to simplify rotational grazing, cows are essentially methodically moved around an area of land with the theory of not depleting or damaging just one area. And the claims about its benefits, such as improving soil health and being able to sequester a significant amount of carbon dioxide, have been scientifically bunked by peer-reviewed studies. But the claims are so broad and outspoken. So here are some of the ways that their claims have been debunked. There is a limit to how much carbon dioxide soil can sequester, so it's not limitless like it's claimed. And then with the methane and nitrous oxide emissions from the cows that are far more potent than carbon dioxide, those emissions exceed the impact of carbon dioxide. And then we simply don't have enough land for this food system for using regenerative agriculture with cows to feed the 7 billion people on the planet. We'd need 5 Earths to be able to switch all that we have with this method. And a great argument that we should have in our back pocket if we're talking to someone who is arguing in favor of rotational grazing is that really rewilding yields the most sequestration. And rewilding would occur the most under a plant-based agriculture system simply because it requires less land. So it would free up more land to be rewilded. And so rewilding is not just with native plants either. It also allows for increased native animal diversity. With rotational grazing, oftentimes native animals like elk are displaced by cows. And we can have regeneration without replacing the native species with non-native species. I don't really have this included in this presentation, but I should mention veganic agriculture. And that is also supportive of the soil, but it doesn't require any exploitation. So to wrap up about greenwashing, excuse me, the most comprehensive analysis to date of the damage farming does to the planet found that going vegan is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on the planet. For those of us who are already vegan, I hope that you can take away some helpful information to add to your advocacy and as a vegan and animal rights activist. And if you're not yet vegan, I hope that you are more inspired to start living vegan today. All right, so now let's look at humane washing. And like I said, you'll notice some overlap in terms. So this overlap, to me, suggests that one can reasonably assume that someone who cares about the environment also cares about non-human animals. And honestly, I need to share with you that there was a time when I believed these terms and these labels to the extent that when I was shopping for my pre-vegan husband, I was willing to pay a lot more for products with these labels, like pasture raised and cage free or certified humane. And then it's interesting to me though that I didn't believe these labels enough for me to start consuming these products, but enough to buy them for him, and he's now vegan. Okay, so looking at this first term, organic, this is really the only one of those terms that is carefully regulated. To be considered organic, an animal has to be raised drug-free, so there can't be any medications like antibiotics. So even if an animal is sick and needs medications to fall under that organic label, they can't be given them. Some of the worst conditions for cows have occurred on organic dairy farms, since they may suffer from conditions like mastitis and inflammation of breast tissue and be denied antibiotics. And then other organic rules are that the feed has to be organic. With some species, they may need access to the outside. Speaking of regulation, I think many of us know that there has been widespread deregulation, and often there are no inspections. So farmers really can put anything on a label except organic and expect no negative consequences. All right, so let's look at some other humane washing terms. Free range really just means that there has to be access to the outside, but that type of access isn't specified. There's that word local again. And local just means nearby. So it doesn't mean anything about how the animal was treated. The animal at a farm down the road doesn't want to die any more than an animal at a farm miles away. Okay, and this screenshot I found from that dairy, that breast milk place farm that I talked about earlier that I visited in 2012 and then immediately went vegan. The cows are treated well and eat well, resulting in a healthier, happier cow and better quality milk. And that makes us happier too. So that's an example of the myth of implied consent that we'll talk about shortly. I thought I would share some other deceptive terms that you might see, even though these may be more related to suggesting that something is healthful. But you see that also these concepts have spilled over into the animal companion world. This animal companion food company is really trying to corner the market on these terms: sustainable, locally grown, humane, family farmed, wild caught. Notice that they used both farmed and wild for the same product. The human psyche is so vulnerable to suggestion that the word farmed is associated with something good when we add the word family, and when it's describing a land animal, but it's associated with something undesirable when it's describing fishes. So how can farmed be both good and bad? And that's because it's our perception, and marketing takes advantage of that. So these humane washing terms support the humane hoax. It's this notion that you can humanely objectify, commodify, consume, and destroy the body of a non-consenting being, that it's okay if you're nice about it, is the humane hoax. I couldn't have said that any better than Justin. Okay, so now we're going to look back at that myth that says it's okay to eat some animals. And this relates back to where I said earlier that as long as you don't eat cows, it's okay. So the myth that it's sustainable and environmentally friendly to eat some animals, but this is also an example of speciesism. Many don't acknowledge the sentience and full depth of personhood of some species like chickens and fishes. So I'm going to talk about both. So that may make it easier for humans to believe the humane hoax with this underlying speciesism. We're going to talk about chickens first. And this would also apply to other birds like turkeys, quails, and ducks, but we're going to focus on chickens. So we often see humane washing terms when it comes to chickens and their eggs. And we see cage-free and free range. And they often come with these bucolic images. And we learn to associate these terms with these kinds of settings, but more often than not, these kinds of settings are not the reality. And even if they are, they're still places where thinking and feeling sentient beings are objectified and commodified. This reflects that last myth. It's that myth of implied consent. And the myth is that if I care for you, then I'm entitled to exploit you or eat you. And we hear about that myth and how it applies to human abuses too, like I did such and such for you, so you owe me. And we know that that's wrong with humans, and it's wrong with non-human animals too. So what do these places usually look like? Before we move on, I want to make sure that you notice this statement about where are the brothers. This is something always to think about when you think about chickens' eggs. Where are the brothers? Okay, so this farm was advertised, this farm was advertised as free range, humanely raised, small family farm. This is the farm where Ruby and her 3 sisters were rescued a little over 3 years ago. And this is the farm, and it was considered cage-free because we see no cages. And the way it's considered free range is probably that there is a little door somewhere in this shed that leads to the outside. But could you imagine someone or all of them from one side being able to make it all the way over to that little bitty door to get some fresh air? And again, because free range is not a regulated term, they may not even have technical access. And then you see how filthy the birds are. The rescuers talked about how the smell of feces and urine was overwhelming. And you see minimal light. When we hear free range and cage free, is this what most people picture, like the average person? No. And not surprisingly to me, but scary, that this particular farm was on the ASPCA's Humane Certified list. Okay, so shall we talk about backyard chickens? There are so many backyard chicken enthusiasts, and I think it's grown since COVID started. And it's this double-edged sword, because it's great that people are getting to see a glimpse into who chickens are, but the chickens are still exploited, so they still see them as a resource. The first question that should come to mind is that one about the brothers. So I want to read to you what I consider to be the clearest explanation about why backyard chickens and eating their eggs is unethical. And this comes from Amy Leenan, who runs the nonprofit Chicken Butt Microsanctuary. She volunteers at Rooster Redemption, and she works at the Animal Rights Coalition. Anyway, so she knows a little something. So this may be a little bit lengthy, so sit back and get comfortable, but I think it's all important. Okay, so long ago, jungle fowl used to lay only 12 to 20 eggs per year, like most other birds, for the purpose of raising a clutch or two. Then we bred them to lay obscene amounts. Modern chickens are now laying 170 to 300 eggs per year, which is not normal nor healthy for their bodies and increases their risk for ovarian cancer, a 35% higher risk, uterine prolapse, and other reproductive diseases. And that's why they're killed by age 2 in the egg industry. Backyard hens die at young ages, almost always from egg-related diseases too. But the backyarder doesn't do necropsies, so they assume that they die of old age, 4 to 6 years generally, when they could live 12 to 20 years, if not cursed with their Frankenstein reproductive systems. Excuse me. So when the hens die, the backyarder has a few options to replace them. If there is a rooster on site, he'll fertilize the eggs. Half of the chicks will be males. More than one rooster is problematic for backyarders due to territorial behaviors and city ordinances against roosters due to crowing and cockfighting concerns. And we have one of the, but this is for me, we have a zoning rule in our town against having roosters too. So this is common. And so the backyarder either kills the young roosters, sells them for meat, or abandons them in the wild, which is also a death sentence. The backyarder can purchase chicks from feed stores, so this is the other alternative, or directly from hatcheries online. The hatcheries will sort out the males from the females. The males are ground up alive or smothered to death, and the females are sent by mail to the backyarder or farm store for purchase. And unfortunately, the sexing process is flawed. So frequently male chicks are accidentally sent, again, unwanted males. The third option is the backyarder can rescue spent egg layers from farms and continue to exploit the hens for their Frankenstein reproductive systems until she dies of cancer. Additionally, because backyard egg eaters consider eggs as a food source, they will still purchase food from restaurants and grocery stores that contain eggs, which certainly came from horrific conditions. And this is still from Amy. My chickens are all rescued from backyarders and slaughterhouses, actually mine too. The hens are implanted with birth control to temporarily stop the unnatural continuous ovulation cycle. This extends their lives and reduces risks of reproductive diseases. Between implants, we feed the eggs back to them to replenish their depleted nutrients, as creating eggs takes a toll on their bodies. She also volunteers at a rooster exclusive sanctuary run by vegans. She said that we get almost weekly requests to take backyard roosters. No one wants roosters. There are never enough rescues for roosters, so they are killed at animal shelters constantly or sold on Craigslist for bait or flesh. Please don't contribute to their deaths by supporting the exploitation of hens. Thank you so much, Amy, for letting me share that. Okay, and thank you for your patience through that. So, and it's all painfully true. I shared this post from next door on the left, just so that you can see this is one of several examples that I will see from people who have roosters who are looking to rehome them, and they may threaten to kill them if they can't. There are posts from people who have found dumped roosters in our town, since we don't allow roosters in our town. This picture is of our newest addition, Sophia. We adopted her last year at age 7, so she's now 8. And we adopted her from backyarders in our town. She had stopped laying and they didn't need her anymore. So we went to their house to meet her. After meeting her, we told them that we'd take her. And she just purred in the background, by the way. So they gave us her filthy feeder, seriously, filthy feeder, and thanked us for taking her. They didn't say goodbye to her. And mind you, they had her for 7 years, so they had her as a baby chick. They didn't do a vet check. They never contacted us to see how things were going or how she was doing, because she was an object to them, a resource. Okay, so now moving on again to animals who we may think it's okay to consume from them. And so when we think of dairy, I think we often, almost always think of cows, but also goats. So I want to share some of what I learned from Andrea Davis of Broken Shovels Farm Sanctuary. Andrea.
Tina?
Yes.
I just want to give you a quick time check. You've got about 3 minutes.
Oh my gosh. Okay, thank you. No, that's good. Okay. So from Andrea, she worked for small family goat dairies in North Carolina and Hawaii. She shared that she specifically looked for farms that were small and had a humane designation, but she saw horrific abuses at every farm. And she said every farm. She could no longer tolerate seeing babies and older goats sent to slaughter. So she moved out to Colorado and started what was going to be the first slaughter-free dairy. And it was super successful. But in 2017, she changed it over to a sanctuary. And this is why. So this is her explanation for why. Let me say this again, because it seems to be the hardest thing for dairy defenders to accept. No matter how small or humane you think a dairy is, all babies will be taken from their mothers, all of them, every farm, every time, and this will happen year after year until the mother is eventually sent to slaughter when her milk production dies. Okay, so what are the solutions? So this is a good place to wrap up. So if we're not already living vegan, we can start living vegan today. We need to consider the source for information that we gather. So if there are articles, we need to see who were the studies funded by. Were they funded by the egg board or the cattle industry or the dairy industry? We can advocate and vote against subsidies and bailouts of animal ag in the United States. The Agriculture Fairness Alliance is doing that. And I know there are other organizations around the world. We can adopt farmed animals and start a microsanctuary. And I guess I can end with this picture of Ruby and my email address if anybody wants to reach out. And I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, Sena.